to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Yes. Commissioner DeVrint? Commissioner Weeks? Present. Thank you. Chair Lubacek? Thank you. Vice Chair Maharo is absent. Commissioner Urena?
Here.
Perfect. Thank you.
Tonight's meeting is live streamed on Cable Channel 3 and our online platforms. To prevent any overlaps in comments, each commissioner will be called upon to speak. Our first item is public comment. This is the time set aside for members of the public to address the Historic Preservation and Cultural Resource Commission on items of interest that are not on the agenda, but are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the commission. Pursuant to the Brown Act, the commission cannot answer any questions or take any action until such time as the matter may appear as an item on a future agenda. If you wish to address the commission, please fill out a speaker card that is available on the back table. Once completed, kindly submit the card to the recording secretary. Speakers will be called to the podium one by one. Each speaker will be given up to 3 minutes to speak. Did we receive any public comments?
No comments at this time, Madam Chair.
I'm not seeing any here. We'll go ahead and move to the next item on the agenda, which is approval of the minutes. These are the minutes from the January 17th, 2024 HP-CRC meeting. Are there any comments on the minutes?
No comments for me. No comment.
All right. Then I will ask for a motion to approve.
A motion to approve?
Thank you, Commissioner Dana, and a second.
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Weeks. If we can do a roll call vote.
Commissioner DeVrint? Commissioner Weeks?
Yes.
Thank you. Chair Lubacek?
Aye.
Thank you. Vice Chair Maharo is absent. And then Commissioner Weeks. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Commissioner Urena.
Aye.
Thank you.
Okay, that takes us to the third item, which is the Citywide Historic Resources Report, Phase 2. We're going to have to interpret it.
Testing? Okay, there we go. Excellent. Okay, let's start again. Good evening, Commissioners. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm Andrew from ARG, as we all know, and I'm here tonight to provide you all with a brief update on the Phase 2 Historic Resources Survey, what we've been up to and what next steps are. Next slide, please. So just a very quick refresher, Phase 2 kicked off at the end of last year, and it involves an intensive level survey of the districts that were preliminarily identified during Phase 1. So you'll recall this was the 9 historic districts that appear to be eligible for listing, and then the 2 planning districts. Next slide, please. So in the past couple months, our team at ARG has been very busy at work, doing mostly behind the scenes stuff. So I just wanted to kind of provide you all with a kind of some highlights of what we've come across so far. Our efforts to date have really been focusing, we've done a deep dive into the background research into each of these preliminary districts. We did a little bit of research during phase 1 for districts, but the focus of phase 1 was really individual resources. So we're taking this opportunity to really do a deep dive into district research and really find anything and everything we can about these areas before going out into the field. So I just wanted to share some of our findings with you. Our research is really boiled down, there's really 3 major categories of materials that we were looking at. The first one are newspapers, and this is just a very small sample of the many newspapers that we were able to find. One of the great things about newspaper reporting in Los Angeles back in the 1920s is that developers were very eager to advertise their developments, their subdivisions. So there is a lot of information out there. It's just a matter of tracking it down and piecing it all together. So these are just some of the newspaper articles that we found. There are articles talking about when tracts were subdivided. A lot of times there's very valuable information in here as well about subdivision names, tract names, subdividers, sometimes architects and contractors as well. So, and you can see they really, the newspaper clippings really kind of run the gamut. There are, articles, there are classified ads, there are occasionally photos and sketches, which is kind of cool. And then on the right side, I know it's hard to see from where you're sitting, but this was an advertising tactic for one of the districts. And the subdivider was really kind of touting the merits of his neighborhood through the perspective of a young boy. And it's honestly kind of ridiculous, but it's a very entertaining read, and it actually has a lot of good information in there. Next slide, please. So the newspapers were really the first major category of research materials. The second category are photos. On the right side is an aerial image. There are quite a few available sources for aerial images online. This is really helpful for us. It helps show how districts and then kind of the surrounding areas around the districts, how they developed over time. They kind of help us piece together a time frame for how a lot of these districts developed. So the aerials are a very useful source. In terms of historic photographs of the districts themselves, there aren't a ton of photos floating around out there that we were able to find, but we were able to find some. The 4 pictures on the left are actually, this is a cool collection from the Huntington Library, and it kind of shows the origins and construction and early development of the San Gabriel Village development, which is one of the planning districts. One thing that I thought was really interesting is that photo on the bottom left corner there. I didn't know this before, but the Percy Bilton company, which was the original developer of San Gabriel Village, actually had an on-site fabrication plant, which is that kind of warehouse-looking building there, where the company, it was all about efficiency. So the company would kind of prefabricate a lot of the components of the houses, and then, as you can see from the other 3 photos, in various stages of construction, they would actually build on the site. So it was, the photos really help, fill in gaps and provide a lot of detail that helps inform our decision making. Next slide, please. And then the third category, so we had newspapers, photographs, and then the third category is maps. I've said this before, I love maps. I'm kind of a map nerd. So we've really have been able to find a lot of really valuable information for districts through maps. The map on the left side is an example of a tract map. We pulled tract maps for all of the areas that we're looking at as potential districts. These are available through the LA County Department of Public Works. They have a very kind of extensive inventory of all of these. And it's, again, kind of hard to see given the scale, but there's all sorts of really interesting information that's very helpful on these tract maps. So there's the names of the subdividers, the underwriters, there's the parcel layout, the street names. Occasionally, street names have been changed over time, so this kind of helps us discover that. One, I guess, kind of interesting anecdote that we found from one of the districts, the historic districts that we identified, was called the Oak Knoll Unit, kind of up near San Marino, Alhambra, and San Gabriel, where they all converge. So from the tract map that we pulled for that site, we learned that that district was actually part of the Lake Vineyard estate, so it has a very kind of storied history in the history of the San Gabriel Valley. And the attorney was actually George Patton, not the general, but his father, who was an attorney, and he was the signatory on that tract map, so that was kind of cool. Map in the center is this is a zoning map available at the Huntington Library. Other maps that we looked at, the bottom right is a Sanborn map, and these are not available for all of San Gabriel, but there are maps available for certain areas of the city. And these are incredibly detailed maps. They have information about the building footprints. They'll have porches and methods of construction, and again, street names. So these are very, very useful for us. The map at the top it's one of the infamous redlining maps that were the product of the HOLC in the 1930s. These maps are also available online, and they are accompanied by narrative reports, which were mentioned in the first phase of the survey, but we're really relying on these too because they shed a lot of light onto the characteristics of these neighborhoods. Next slide, please. And then finally, we've done some of our own mapping. This is using GIS software. And these two are just some samples of the maps that we produced internally for our own kind of edification. So these, what you're looking at here, these are construction dates, and it's decades of development. So in terms of kind of nailing down periods of significance for these districts, it's really helpful to, at least for me, again, as a map person, to visualize how this all happened over time. Patterns kind of jump out, and it really helps answer a lot of the questions. When did these neighborhoods start developing, and when did the primary period of development end? So again, very useful information for us. Next slide, please. So that's kind of where we are now. As you can see, we're approaching the approximate midpoint of the project. We're wrapping up with our research phase, our behind-the-scenes work. From here, what our team is doing is we're compiling a list of recommendations regarding boundaries and periods of significance for each of the districts. So we will be sharing that with staff, with Sam and Jen very shortly. And then we will, once they have a chance to review, we will discuss and answer questions and go from there. So once the research is done, once the boundaries and the periods of significance are established, then we will be actually going out and documenting districts. So it'll be our team from the ARG walking around each district, photographing each building, making note of character-defining features, alterations, architectural style, et cetera. And then most importantly, assigning contributor, non-contributor status for historic districts. And that's kind of, that's the information that everyone wants to know at the end of the day is, am I a contributor, am I in a district? So that's what we'll be doing, and that will be ramping up very soon. Next slide, please. And that's actually it for my presentation this evening. It's brief, so we've been mostly working behind the scenes, but we are reaching kind of an important juncture in our work plan, or in our schedule, excuse me, and we'll be heading out in the field soon. So with that, thank you very much, and I'm available to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We'll start with commissioner comments or questions. Commissioner DeVrent?
Yeah, is the link out to this deck, is that on the online agenda, or is there anywhere for us to get this deck?
I'm going to ask staff. I believe it's available online.
Yes, typically what staff would do would post the PDF of the presentation on the webpage that's dedicated to the project.
Okay.
And if there are specific materials, we're happy to share everything we have. So,
All right.
Commissioner Weeks?
No questions, but thank you again for your progress and the presentation tonight.
thank you.
Commissioner Orena?
No, nothing to add, except I applaud all the work that you and the team has done so far. It's looking great.
Thank you.
I just have a couple questions for you. I wanted to make sure that I understood that in terms of the research you're doing in this phase, it's directed towards both the potential historic districts and also the planning districts?
Yes, that's correct.
And in terms of what you're looking for, is it just sort of broad-based, you look through newspapers and anything that hits lands, or are you sort of coming with a not to use the term hit list, but a hit list of areas that you're trying to?
We're casting our net pretty wide, or that's at least how we started. So in terms of what we're searching for, we just want to know more information, not citywide, but specific to the 9 historic districts and to a lesser extent the 2 planning districts. So our research has been really focused on that. One thing that we have discovered, which has made research a little bit challenging, but interesting, is that a lot of the newspaper sources for developments in the city of San Gabriel will often reference adjacent cities. So it'll say this tract was subdivided in Alhambra or San Marino or sometimes even Pasadena, which is crazy because we're not even adjacent to Pasadena. And a lot of times they don't mention San Gabriel, which it's interesting. So it's kind of like detective work, which I personally kind of find exciting. We'll see a newspaper article, and it sounds like the district that we want to be researching, but it will say Alhambra or San Marino, so we have to do additional research to kind of piece it all together.
Feels like that's a persistent problem for our city, past and present.
Yeah.
I was wondering, in the research that you're doing with photographs, if there's been any discussion or interaction with the Historical Association. I know that they have cabinets full of photos of homes from the area.
Yeah, we have reached out to the Historical Association. It sounds like they don't have the staff resources right now to really facilitate going through their collections. So we might reach out just one more time. We don't want to be bothersome to them, but if we are able to access their materials, that would be great. So we'll be sure to do that.
I was going to speak a little bit more to it in my commissioner report, but in case you don't stay, the Historical Association's next topic is the local historian of the village. It's a woman who spent a long time collecting lots of photos and has great information. So maybe even after the fact reaching out, that might be a little bit more curated than the museum itself.
Yeah, that would be great.
At this time, we will turn to public comment. Did we receive any comment on this item?
No public comment at this time, Madam Chair.
All right, so seeing none, we'll go ahead and close public comment at 6:48. Any other comments from the commissioners? All right, I don't think there's any action needed. We just take this as information. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's exciting to see. That will move us on to the 4th item, which is Certified Local Government, CLG, application update and the proposed zone text amendment for cleanup items to the Historic Preservation and Cultural Resource Ordinance. And we're going to have a presentation from staff.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair and members of the commission. This presentation will be a little bit of a tag team between staff and the city's architectural historian. Jen is available for the technical and more detailed responses, and I will start with the broader outline of what this item is about this evening. And so as the commission sees here, it has to do with the city's historic preservation and cultural resource ordinance. This is a proposed zone text amendment, ZTA 24-002. And the action that is requested by the commission this evening is to provide comments so that staff can return. We're going to listen to the comments and the question this evening, and hopefully we can capture everything in this discussion to bring back for formal recommendation action from this commission to be forwarded to the Planning Commission and City Council. And so we'll start with what led us to this point tonight, and that is essentially the city's Certified Local Government program, the CLG application. And really what this application is, in particular for the commissioners that may not have been on the commission at the time when the city made its application, And we're going to get to the dates, but I believe it was 2019. But essentially what this application and program is a partnership between the local agency, which is the City of San Gabriel, and the State of California Office Historic Preservation Office Agency, and the National Park Service, which is the federal agency, and is responsible for administering the National Historic Preservation Program. What the program encourages is direct participation of the local government in identifying, evaluating, registering, and preserving historic properties, and also to encourage a local preservation program. And as part of the program, the city will be eligible for federal grants, and these grants are important. It has been mentioned throughout the last couple of years for any designation opportunities that the city can have to assist property owners with any programs that the city can offer. So having grant funding and being able to access that funding is very important to the continuation of the city's preservation program. And so the requirements of being a certified local government is to enforce the appropriate state and local laws and regulations for designation of historic properties, to establish a preservation commission, which was one of the very first things that the city did after it updated this ordinance. Also maintaining a survey and an inventory of historic properties, and then providing that opportunity for the public to participate in the preservation program, and then to perform the responsibilities that are delegated by the state. And so here we are with very important dates. Hopefully the font is not too small. We try to get it into 2 slides, but there has been a lot of work since the current ordinance was adopted by the City Council, and this occurred in 2017. And prior to that, the city's preservation ordinance under the title of Historic Preservation of Buildings and Structures was adopted in 1965. So it was 50 years after the original adoption that the city, and really with the encouragement from the community and the public to revisit the ordinance for a more stronger preservation program is what led to the updated ordinance in 2017. And as mentioned, the Historic Preservation Commission was formed and held its first meeting in December of 2018. And following that in 2019 is when the City Council authorized the city to file its CLG application with the state. And then in 2020, the pandemic occurred, and that delayed the review process with the stay-at-home order. It was just very difficult to get the responses and to have everybody in the office, so that added a bit to the delay. But finally, as things picked up again, the state was able to provide comments. They reviewed the city's application and provided comments back to the city, and immediately communicating that based on their review, there were some concerns with the city's ordinance, and we'll get into that in the next few slides. But immediately after receiving the comments, the city staff brought forth a proposed zone text amendment to clean up those items of concerns, and that was done within the month of receiving the comments. It was something that staff really wanted to just continue to move forward on. Following that meeting, then the text amendment was forwarded to the Planning Commission and then to the City Council for consideration. And then here, again, just a month or two after, in September, the text amendment went to the Planning Commission. Then in October of the same year, it went before the City Council. The City Council understood the importance of the amendment and approved that minor modification. In the meantime, also within 2021 is when the city was continuing on the implementation of the ordinance, and throughout that year worked on the city's historic context statement. So while the city was monitoring this application, at the staff level was continuing with the implementation of the ordinance itself, so that did not delay any other project. And then with the updated ordinance and the updated application, with the assistance of the chair as well as the mayor, just updating all of the commission information, refiled its application and sent that back to the state. And at that point, the state was comfortable with providing a certification agreement, and forwarding the CLG application to the National Park Service. So that was great progress, and we were very excited about that. And then once we got the review, then we got the feedback back early of 2022 that there were some additional concerns, and as mentioned, we'll get into what those concerns were. But all the while taking the time, staff with the city's architectural historian, and really with the time dedicated by the state, just sitting down with staff, going through each section by section. So that's not reflected here, and as mentioned by Andrew, even with the historic research survey, a lot of work is done behind the scenes, and sometimes staff tries to provide those updates, but essentially what it came down to was really going through each section so the state can walk staff and Jen through what those items of concerns were. All the while, the city's architectural historian has also been a part of plan reviews for any projects that are subject to design review, for any additions and remodel projects, just to make sure that nothing was getting through that may have some potential to be a contributor to a district or potential to be nominated as a landmark. And so the objectives for this evening, the broader objective that was communicated both by the state and the federal government, it was really to provide the clarification between the responsibilities between the local agency, the city, the state, and the federal government. And that was really their concern, both with the first round of comments followed by the second round of comments. And really what they needed the city to understand was that the city's ordinance outlines the city's local procedures, and that the city's ordinance does not speak for the state or the federal government's application and review procedures. So that was very important to them as part of their review process. And so for the community to understand, the register that is referenced in the ordinance is the San Gabriel Register of Cultural Resources, and so that's important to understand. There are some references to the California Register of Historical Resource, and that is at the state level, and then the National Register of Historic Places, and that is at the federal level. So there are three categories, again, very distinct from each other, with different application and reviewing requirements. And then on a lesser level would be the properties that have the potential to be eligible for federal tax benefits and other state preservation incentives, the Mills Act, so that's something at a lower level than being designated as a resource. And then additional objectives and what the commission mainly sees in the first attachment would be the additions and deletions represented by the underlines and the strike-throughs throughout the ordinance. And so we will talk about that in a little bit. But the other objective was to simplify the code. That was one thing that was communicated by the state, and I think as secondhand information from the federal government as well, it is a very detailed ordinance that the city has. Sometimes details are helpful, other times it may be a little bit more than what's needed. So as part of the state's review with the city staff, it was really to condense and to clearly state the regulations as best as possible without having to really get, even in examples, providing 2 or 3 examples was considered adequate, and we didn't need to get into an entire list of 10 items as examples, for example. And then also, again, to remove any repetition, to clarify procedures for designated resources, and then to clarify the California Environmental Quality Act requirements. So that was another big concern from the federal government. So key terms that are also important for the community to understand. One of the terms that is seen throughout the document would be cultural resource. And when that term comes up, what it is, it defines buildings and sites and structures and objects, each of which may have historic, architectural, archaeological, cultural, or scientific significance. Then you have historical resource, and this is defined in the resources code, but there are CEQA guidelines implications associated with historical resources. So when that term comes up, there are environmental requirements associated with that. Also, something that the city's architectural historian staff in the state worked hard on was to make sure that it's clear what's a historic landmark, what's a historic district, and this is again captured within the city's survey and eventual inventory, which was evaluated within the framework of the city's historic context statement. So those are the relationships between what is a landmark and what will potentially eventually be a historic district. And then one item that staff is looking for feedback from the commission on would be in the current code, there is reference to a conservation overlay zone, and this refers to areas that are not historic districts, or they do not qualify for a designation as mentioned by ARG. In the survey work, ARG has used the term planning district. So one thing that comes up is if there's a preference that the city maintains conservation overlay zone, and in moving forward and working with ARG, that is the term that will be used. Or if in hearing that term throughout the presentations from ARG planning districts, that maybe that's a little bit more easier to understand from the community standpoint. So if the commission can provide feedback on that so that we make sure that the terminologies are consistent as we move forward with the projects. And then what we are looking at associated with the districts or the overlay zone is to eventually get to the point of developing guidelines for design review by the Preservation Commission. And as part of the incentives to encourage preservation, that review would only be with the Preservation Commission, and it would not require design review because again, that's one of the incentives offered to any project or property that has interest in being a historical or a historic landmark. And so here's where we get into an example of the CEQA concerns. So as part of the initial update, one of the main provisions that was identified by the state and the government was the language regarding automatic nomination. And initially, the idea was anything that is nominated at the national or state level would be automatically nominated at the local level. And the concern from the state and federal government is that there are CEQA implications and requirements that comes with any action that is taken on by a public agency that is reviewing projects and applications that may have adverse impacts upon historical resources. And so they made it clear that they do not have the authority or the power to make those decisions for local agencies, and therefore wanted to make it clear and to separate that, again, the state and the federal governments have their process, and the city has its own local process. And although it can go the other way around, where the city can start with a project itself and then eventually make an application with the state or the federal government. But again, these are all separate procedures. And so again, with that, staff knows that in looking at attachment A's, there are a lot of strike-throughs and underlines. It is very overwhelming. Again, it took staff and the city's architectural historian and the state almost a year to kind of comb through everything. However, that doesn't mean that the product is final, which is the purpose of the meeting tonight. This is a workshop format to have that discussion if there's something that was missed, if something should remain in place. We are welcoming all of those feedbacks so that we do it correctly this time, and hopefully we get that certification from the National Park Service. And so with that, this concludes staff's presentation. And again, Jen is available and myself for questions.
Thank you. So we'll just go straight to commissioner questions, comments. Commissioner DeVrent?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. I've got some tags here. So my first one is that this chapter 153, it's not in force as of now, right? It's not, this isn't, we're here to go through this and approve it before this becomes part of the city ordinance?
That's correct. So the clean draft that is attachment B, that is what will be, whereas the working draft is what is currently in.
Gotcha, okay. All right, so that was my first question on that, and it's dense. So I went through. My second one was, I know that this is a workshop kind of format here, but in my opinion, it would be great to have a committee or a workshop with this group maybe to go over these and discuss this a little bit more in detail instead of like over the dining room table over the weekend or something like that. To be able to ask and answer questions to both the Planning Commission and the historian as we go through this. I don't know if that's something that we could plan on that. So those are my first two initial things, so I don't miss anything. And then a lot of it that I'm going to ask tonight here is just basically maybe not my understanding of this or getting a little bit more clarification on some of the items here. The one, I wanted I wondered if you could give me an example in the city right now of a conservation overlay zone so that I could have that in my mind. Is there something locally around here that I could, that I could visually understand what the conservation overlay zone would be, as opposed to a historical district, for instance?
Yeah, we don't have anything in San Gabriel right now that's a conservation overlay zone. However, it's usually a mechanism that cities use to function as a historic district. It's just usually a choice of making it part of the zoning ordinance or actually designating it outside of the zoning ordinance as a historic district. So it's usually simply a city's choice is to go one way or the other, but they usually function in the same way. So with our ordinance, we do have the conservation overlay in here, which was prompted one of the questions, like, is this functioning? Do we want this? We aren't really proceeding in this way. We're proceeding with historic districts. And yes, with planning districts, as Andrew and the ARG team have brought up, that's somewhat of a broad term. It could be, that we move forward with those as conservation overlays, but they would not mean the same thing as a historic district in this case. They would not be something that's eligible for designation. It's just simply the name we would put on them. And, we would be able to graph those, identify the boundaries of those, and with a conservation overlay versus a historic district. So, yeah.
So would an example be an area that has some historical features, buildings, things like that, but there's other buildings or that have been built on past that or whatever that don't necessarily qualify, kind of like mixed use is the way to go.
Yeah, so the way that this would work, I mean, it's like I think of conservation overlays in terms of a designation, because that's the way it works in other cities. So I kind of think of it more as a planning district, but the idea is that it's an area that has historic importance. There's some significance there. Perhaps there's been too many modifications over time, and so therefore it doesn't precludes eligibility. However, there are special considerations in the planning process, and so we want to call it out so that it's not forgotten as an important historic place, even though it's not eligible for designation. And in that way, staff or the commission in their review process can take that into consideration, in the decisions that are made.
Okay, that helps. That helps. Thank you. There's a section here. So a couple of sections in here. Pardon me as I flip through this. Okay, so it would be under 153-610 designation procedures, and then it would say a strike-through item under F, and then it's like I think it's 2. The subsequent demolition of non-contributors, new construction, things of that nature, it's struck through. And I saw this in another section, but is there protections built in to this ordinance here? I didn't see anything that said that, but I saw it on the slide here, and I was wondering about review of items for demolition that are, like, say, for instance, in a historical zone. Does that make sense that somebody in one of these historical districts wants to tear down a house in that area and build something new? Is there a protection built into this ordinance for that? And I'm missing it. I thought I saw it this weekend, but now I lost it in my, but I saw 2 strike-throughs of subsequent demolition, but this one says for non-contributors or new construction. I'm assuming that's a building that's a non-contributor to the historical district, or new construction or alterations to a historical building at one point. Is that clear on that? Even though it's struck through, I'm just trying to get an idea of that.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. And yeah, feel free to take your time too with these. I love the workshop style here that allows us both to kind of find the sections and figure out what we're asking and answering. So, so it can be most helpful. But yes, so when you said historic zone, so I just want to clarify that if we're talking about a historic district, that's the eligible property or the designated property is the entire district. And so in the ordinance, yes, there would be review for a demolition of a non-contributor within an eligible or designated historic district. In some cases, we have, that you might see something struck and wonder, wait a minute, that should be in there. But sometimes we've struck things in one area because it is covered in a different area.
Yeah, and I think that's the case with this one. I just couldn't remember where
Right,
I saw
that
it the
might
second or
be.
third time.
I actually do have all of my notes from all of the meetings between me and OHP, so I can tell you that particular exact section we determined could be eliminated and simplified by moving the reference to the initial review up to section 153.606, San Gabriel Register of Cultural Resources, where it fits better. So yes, and my little note here says projects involving registered listed properties will be subject to the initial review process for historic appropriateness and certificate of demolition process as described in this chapter. So, and that was simply why it was struck here.
Okay.
But
And that's 606 item,
well, I'd have to go to that section one second.
sorry.
Actually, to your clean copy. One moment. 606. That was the recommendation here. So let's see. Let me open up my clean copy. Also, the recommendation when we went through that, by the way, that would have been, well, I can't tell you off the top of my head what date that is in the year-long process, but sometimes the recommendation to move it somewhere else, and then once we got to that section, we may have reworded or something. So, one moment, and I'll find my clean copy and let's look at that section together. So I think that this was very simplified in this section, and that would be 153.606, and I believe that would be I. So you'll have to go to a couple of places to track it down. So I says, is this my clean copy? Initial review,
Yep.
projects involving registered listed properties will be subject to the initial review process. And then you have to go to that initial review process section to see how it's described there. But like I said, the designated property is the district, and so anything within the boundaries of the district would be subject to review.
Okay, gotcha. Great, thank you. And then just a couple of general questions here on this 153613, duty to maintain designated cultural resources. And it lists, so my question on this, and I haven't read the overall city ordinance in a long time, if I have read it at all, but I just wanted to make sure, so these criteria here, that's something that's in a historical district, or if it's a landmark or something like, or something of that nature, the deterioration of, like, just say item 3, deterioration of external chimneys that causes leaning, sagging, or whatever it is. Is this criteria the same throughout the city, whether it's a historical district or not? What I'm trying to say is that why would something in a historical district be required to follow all of these, and the city have the authority to go in there and say, hey, you have to repair all of these items, and these items are part of this to maintain this historical district, but something that falls outside of the historical district doesn't have that same criteria. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say? And is that in the city code that these same criteria are for areas that are outside of it as well? And I guess what I'm getting at is that when a historical district is designated with the 51% of the people that are there, that I think it's going to be really, really clear, or really important for us as a city and as a historical commission to let people know what they're kind of getting into in these kinds of situations when those things are designated, and that realtors, and I don't know how, that these things are disclosed to homeowners so that they know that when they're going into these areas that that these are requirements, that you are in a historical area and you have certain requirements that you have to follow for these homes, right? A general demolition, I think that should be, that's pretty easy. A real estate agent could say, as you know, you can't come in here, if you're thinking of tearing this house down or whatever it is, you might have to go through some review processes or something like that. And I just want to make sure when we go through these processes that people aren't caught off guard, because I think that could be problematic. And I see and at the other side for developers and things to come in, because where my daughter goes to school, her college is in a historical district as well, and you can see where developers are starting to ride the razor-thin line of developing within those areas and what they're doing to do it, and you can see the houses that are following that. So I guess I'm just trying to make it clear that there's some homeowner protection built into this. I don't know if that's the right word, but so that people understand that, because these historical districts haven't been designated yet, right? So these people who have bought houses maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago are now going to this is going to be applied to their property. And I think that if I'm reading this right, that just want people to understand that, and how do we make sure that they get that? So I don't know if there's an answer for that, or...
Yes, such a good point, really. Noticing the public is really important. And there is a section, and I couldn't identify it right this minute, but I can find it for you, where the city is charged with developing a program for such notification. And so, yes, that's incredibly important. But regarding your first point about duty to maintain, I'm with you. I haven't read other parts of our ordinance. So, but it should be, it usually is routinely in a city's ordinance that you do have, as a property owner, regardless if it's historic or not, you have a duty to maintain. So I'm not sure where exactly it is or how it's stated, so maybe that, staff can speak to that.
Yes, so to add to that, the city does have general provisions under what's considered a nuisance or property maintenance requirements, where if something is dilapidated or just really in need of repair, in particular anything associated with housing conditions, then there are those requirements that a property owner must address those conditions. Where there's a difference between an area of property that is not designated versus one that is designated is, in that particular case, if it happens to be in poor conditions, hazardous conditions, then the easy response is just a demolition and a removal, which is the standard requirement for any property. However, for a designated property, then it triggers other standards and requirements, and I think Jen can speak to that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam. Yes, I do want to add to that, and not to create confusion, but just to clarify that it is good to have these examples here and this listed in the ordinance. It might also be a good idea to cross-reference to other sections, other ordinances that a property owner or resident could look at. But as Sam says, something that we have seen in historic preservation is called demolition by neglect. And so it's just an extra call out here. If this was not in here, a property owner would have a duty to maintain, but it's an additional call out to help a property owner to understand, because we want to avoid something like that. And then also to point out too that in historic preservation, condition is actually not something that we're supposed to consider when we evaluate something for eligibility. The only time it really is considered is when there's a material deterioration to the extent that integrity is compromised. So, something needing to be re-roofed or, whatever, there's poor condition, we can fix these things. However, if it's been going on and it's to the point where there is no material left here to, restore something, or accurately reconstructed under the standards, then we have an impact to integrity. So there's a couple reasons why it's really important to have this in here.
Okay. And I think that that would be valuable to maybe cross-reference, I don't know if that's possible, to cross-reference that to the city ordinance or the city code that already shows that, say, you're really under that obligation anyways already. It's just that now with a historical home, for instance, I mean, a contractor may come in and say, yeah, your chimney is shot, and, they could say, do you ever use it? No, then take it down, right? And then maybe, maybe they have a little bit more of a responsibility to either put a new chimney up or to make that side of the house look more, to the, whatever, I'm sure that would go through a review process, but I just want to make sure that, when I'm doing this, or if I'm out in the community explaining it to somebody, because I'm adjacent to one of these historical districts that's kind of nominated for this, I want to be able to have those conversations with the public to talk about it. So that's it. And then I did have a question. It was just on, it's 153-614, D item 2, it's new infill. I just wanted to get a clarification on what infill construction meant.
Sure. And actually, 153-614 took us the longest time. It was the most complex section, and we even skipped it and went back to it. So, and I'm sorry, you said 153-614. What was the subsection?
D,
okay.
item 2, and I right above it is the demolitions. That's the thing I was looking for before. But the infill, I just was under.
Oh, what is infill? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So infill is when you'd have a neighborhood, say, and there's a vacant property or a property gets demolished and something new is going in. You can also have edge fill. We say infill, but really it could be edge fill as well. So, and that is just, making the point that if you're within a historic district, you're within the boundaries of the property that's designated or eligible for designation. And so, therefore, just because it's a non-contributor or just because it's a vacant property and something new is getting constructed, there is still oversight and design review for that.
All right, and that would be, and that's basically, they're coming and say you are in a historical district, your home has to meet certain requirements, or you'd look at the planning of the house to make sure it fits in. Okay, that's clear, and I think I only have one more tab here, and then I'll. Oh yeah, it was, but in general, it's a big strikeout. It's the. And I just was 153-620, the relocation of designated cultural resources. It's struck out over 2, and then certification of demolition there is again. And I just was wondering, was this a repetition in someplace else, or was this just removed? Was all of this removed? Just what the reasoning was for the removal of that? Yeah.
Sure, just one second. I'm opening that section and looking at all of our comments on it. And let's see. Let me just read through them one moment so I can answer your question. Well, I have a lot of notes here, and they're on how to revise this entire section, but not about striking it all together. So I'd have to look at a different file to see why we moved from that. But let's see. I do have a note that says it says under CEQA process only are there no specific procedures for relocation of inventory properties. The following demolition section applies to both register and inventory properties. So Sam, perhaps your recollection is a little bit better than mine on this section?
Yes, I mean, if we had the notes, I think that's what I was kind of waiting for. However, though, if I can just speak broadly, I think it's because the procedure and the criteria is covered under the initial review section, that whether it be demolition, relocation, new construction, that anything that's within a district or is a landmark will be subject to that review process. So that was one thing that we wanted to streamline and to consolidate, that essentially, although it's broken out separately, relocation, demolition, construction, that essentially what is important to what you're saying for a property owner to understand is that it's subject to the review of the Preservation Commission, and that's the important takeaway.
Okay.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and that's refreshing my memory as well. So, yeah, and I think what the driving question on this section was, can the director approve relocation outside of a commission review process? And that answer is no. So there didn't really need to be an entire separate section because it is covered under the review process by the commission.
All right, well, that's pretty much it. Thank you for answering my questions. You know, my only comments, I guess, were to have a more, if possible, to once this gets redone, and you know, I did read through both the strike through and then just confirmed to make sure that I was doing it, but to have somebody to kind of go over it a little bit more in detail so we have a fuller understanding of what it is, that would be great. And then my only other comment or remark would be just in that section that lists the criteria for maintenance and upkeep and everything like that, if it's possible to already reference, you know, the city ordinance where that might be in place, so that people understand that this isn't just new to that historical district, but the citywide, this is a requirement anyways, if that is truly the case. But okay, that's it for me. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Weeks?
I have really not gone down into the depth I need to on all this. Just a lot of material here. So I'm soaking up all of all of the comments that we've had so far. Just a lot to digest. At this time, I don't have any questions.
All right, Commissioner Urena?
I'm not by any means a legal eagle, but I do appreciate the fact that this was 5 pages shorter than the first one I tried to read, not realizing I was going to read it again. I just had one question as far as the 153-630, the penalties. I know it references the .320 through .33. Those were not included in here, right? So is that just a standard structure of fees charged for penalties based on other ordinances that are already in place? So on 153.630 penalties, B says violations of any provisions of 153.20 through 153.333 is hereby determined to constitute an infraction. And it specifies, you know, $100, two to five.
Yeah, this section wasn't actually revised, so I can't speak to that. We just revised I think the number was funny on it or something. So that was fixed, but I don't think we did any changes in this section. So Sam, do you have more information on the question or an answer for that?
You're correct. It may be a sectional reference, but there is a dedicated subchapter to, I just had it, to administration and enforcement. So it does reference a general.
So that's just like a customary penalties and fines for certain things.
For violations,
Which
yes.
will just attach to this.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I am so appreciative of all of the work, first and foremost. The cleaning up that went into this and the careful editing is really commendable, and I am terrifically grateful because this has been something I've wanted to see with CLG for such a long time. Looking at the timeline, I feel like it's ironic that we were one of the first to have a preservation ordinance, and we're also one of the first to be subjected to this level of review. So it feels fitting and unfair at the same time. I do have questions. I appreciate the discussion that's already happened. I think just as a general point of feedback, working through the two documents in the future, if it's possible to have page numbers on the attachments, it would be really helpful. Even just in facilitating our own discussion, I feel like half the time I'm scrambling to remember what section was called out as I'm flipping through. I know that if I brought my laptop, the PDF attachment would allow me to search, but old school, it's a little bit slower and cumbersome. So page numbers on the attachments would help a great deal. I do, and I'm just going to go through the clean copy, I think, and reference that and hopefully capture all my notes. I wanted to dovetail a little bit on Commissioner DeVrent's questions around the conservation overlay zone and focus that a bit towards our discussion tonight about whether it's better to go with planning district, just in terms of communication. Am I correct in assuming that a conservation overlay zone functions a bit like a specific plan? So, for example, we have the Mission District specific plan that provides some guidelines, although it's not a formal district right now. So in that sense, when we talk about a planning district, it would have design guidelines that might give force to massing and scale, maybe character defining features in that area, but not at the level of a designation.
Yeah, that might be a good way to think of it here. I think the concern is that we would be applying a conservation overlay zone to something that's not designated or even eligible for designation, and it's almost like that is that really necessary, I suppose, to have it as a zoning designation rather than, it's really, if we're thinking about using it for a planning district, it's really overkill for a planning district. And we could use this as a mechanism for historic districts that are designated, but we don't have to. It's not defined that way here. The way it's defined, it would be applied to a planning district, or what Andrew's been calling it a planning district. And so I don't think it's really needed for that. And you're right, it is something more like you describe in this case. And to write design guidelines and have designs, construction standards is a little bit much for for what's being talked about as a planning district here.
Okay. Yeah. In that same area, there were a couple of definitions that were removed, like the sensitivity maps, removal of the definition of director. And that caught my eye just because when the ordinance was passed or updated in 2017, director actually got quite a lot of discussion from council as one of the terms. But I also was curious about removing sensitivity maps.
Yes, let's talk about sensitivity map first. I was, when I first joined the team here, I was so excited to hear that there was a sensitivity map, and I was like, where is it? I need to see that. And we haven't yet developed the sensitivity map, and so because it's simply not, not something that we have at this point, I think that was a staff decision to strike that for clarity until such time as we do have a sensitivity map. Sam, please correct me if I'm wrong or you want to add to that.
That makes sense.
No, that's correct, right. So what we were looking for was if somebody were to come and to implement and to request these items, it's just not something that the city currently has. If it's something that the commission feels should stay in place, so that the council, again, it would require funding and dedicated effort to actually put together something like that, then it's something that we can absolutely retain.
Well, and also, there was so much that came up in this review with OHP that there was so much in the ordinance that didn't actually need to be in an ordinance. And I think that's because the ordinance was, written before there was truly well, the ordinance was written long ago, but then this large revision in 2017 was before we really had launched the program. And so we were working, I assume, on really defining a lot of things in this ordinance. And there's a lot in here that is better suited for like a program or, something that can be a policy or something like that. So for the commission to direct staff, say, to develop a sensitivity map, that can be done outside of an actual ordinance. So it's not something that has to be in here to happen. And then there's a lot of things, that can be on the program or policy level to where they're a little bit, these would be things that are somewhat more flexible, so that we're not tied to something that's defined in an ordinance or that's in an ordinance, but it's something that might fluctuate. However, you can capture standard procedures or policies, in planning in those types of ways and not have it be in the ordinance.
Okay. So then in that same vein, the removal of things around improvement, initial review, that's all something that's captured then later in okay.
Yeah, you've got it. There's a lot of different reasons why things are struck or changed, so I'm glad for you to ask. But yes, that was the case for initial review, administrative clearance, et cetera. Major alterations, these are all defined later in those sections, and we just felt it was repetition that was not necessary and could potentially actually be confusing. So,
And then in the case of, I was looking to make sure I had the full term. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, is that again something that is captured elsewhere and no longer? This is still, I'm still in definitions. Right, multiple property documentation and then Native American resources. In between that, the National Environmental Policy Act, reference to that was removed.
Yes, so from, so from a planning standpoint, the NEPA is the environmental review that's conducted at the federal level, and the equivalent to that would be the CEQA, which is the California level.
Okay, all right. Let's see. I had a question in section 153.604, so this is actually about our commission. We had some discussion about the frequency of our meetings, and I noted that this stayed at a quarterly basis, although we had talked about, and you, I thought, had mentioned at some point that it was suggested that we meet more than, at least 4 times, possibly more.
yes, and that's something that can change, based on direction from the commission. Yes, and it was my recommendation at a prior meeting to increase the number of regular meetings because to safeguard, ourselves to make sure that we're complying with our CLG requirements, because we are required to meet 4 times. And so if we have something that's canceled and it's, maybe difficult to reschedule during the holidays, we are at risk for not meeting those obligations. So, and it's something that could perhaps be modified. You can modify it very, very clearly, or you could, maybe say meet at least 4 times a year or something, and then actually, if it's every other month or if it's every month or however that turns out, can be something that fluctuates, on a policy basis instead of being in the ordinance. But it's entirely up to you. It could be handled either way.
Yes, and thank you for the catch. I think that was one that staff did not want to predefine for the commission. And that if that is a consensus amongst the commission to provide that direction to staff and then also to provide any recommended language, then that is what would be included to be brought back to the commission.
I think in sort of my reading of it and the discussions we've had, I would be comfortable with a permissive change to that language, at least quarterly, and that way we don't become too prescriptive. It allows for some flexibility, but I think one of our concerns is that right now, as it's written, it feels equally prescriptive, and so maybe a change to bring at least quarterly into that section. I had another comment in section 153.605, and this is in the San Gabriel Inventory of Cultural Resources, and one item that was struck was inventory notification, and I think in some ways this gets back to Commissioner DeVrent's point. We've done a lot of changes as part of the mandate of the ordinance, and while we do our best to let the community know that we've done a survey and we've done an inventory, people may be surprised to find that a picture was taken of their house and a DPR was created, and it feels, I just was struck that that notification was removed and wondered what mechanism we're going to use.
Yeah, and this is an example of a situation where you might find something struck and be concerned, but it is in the ordinance still, so you will find, and in your digital copy, this will be easier to find, and probably would have reassured you before even the meeting. But this is found in 153609B, notification of property owners. This is designation procedures. So take a look at that. Notification certainly is in here. In fact, when I just did a find on my PDF copy, it pops up 16 times.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah, there's several points here because this is a very important topic. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. I do understand the need to have a designation process that speaks for what's happening in the city and to let the federal and state in, let's see, section 153610, this is the designation procedures. F2 was struck, and this was regarding infill when non-contributing, goodness, I'm blanking on the word, non-contributors are being demolished, and I was curious why that was removed. Again,
Sorry
it's
about
what
that.
goes on what-
Yes, I think this is the one we talked about earlier, right? And so I redirected you to where it was referenced, and yes, and I'm just going to look back at that really quick. It's 153610, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, so the, yes, it was eliminated here to be simplified, else, and simplified because it was moved to the initial review section 153606. I'm sorry. Then the discussion of initial review was moved to 153606, where it fits better. And then you would need to go to the initial review section. So sorry, there's a couple of little breadcrumb trails here, but yeah, it certainly has not been taken out. So maybe when you have a question in that section, we can kind of take a look at that as well.
Right, and I think one thing that we were thinking was to bring it more towards the front of the ordinance without it having been buried within the procedures and criterias itself.
Okay. And then I was curious in section 153.616, CEQA references were removed in that section, and is that because now they are all contained within 153.619, where you have the section that's directly referencing items that are pursuant to CEQA?
Yes, exactly, and they're almost all in that one section. But that was one thing that OHP, the state, really strongly recommended was to actually create a CEQA section. And given the way the ordinance was already written, and the widespread reference to CEQA everywhere, staff determined that was a bit harder to do. Is it can completely take it out of everywhere, but it's almost all taken out of other sections, so that we have something like a CEQA section in 619.
Okay. That was, but as I read through, that was my assumption. And that may be the last of the, let's see. There was one more removal that I was hoping to have explained, and this is far down in 153.628. So that is identification, documentation, and management of archaeological, paleontological. And I'm looking in section H. And I don't know if the numbering, the new clean copy numbering is number 5, but there were items after that that were stricken, and I was wondering if I could have an explanation of that.
Okay, I think I've navigated there, just about. Let's see. I gotta go down just a little more. Can you
This gave a
possibly-
little bit of a timeline in terms of when something has been identified. Originally, it read on the director's recommendation, reports relating to the discovery of significant archaeological
Yes.
or Native American resources.
Yes. Okay, so this one was a recommendation by me to strike or revise somehow, because again, I think this section appears here as a function of having written the ordinance before really doing a lot of practical application of the ordinance. And my experience in the field and being actually on construction sites with Native American monitoring and paleontological monitoring, and often with multiple tribes, it simply wasn't very practical. This type of thing would really never practically happen in the field. It's very difficult to stop construction on a construction site for the time it would take to actually complete this. So that's why instead of doing something like this, when we put in place monitoring, whether it's for archaeological monitoring or paleontological monitoring, usually on the front end of that, we're defining the way we're going to go about doing that, and the relationships between like the main architect and the tribes, if the tribes are involved, and how we'll schedule, how many days this will take, and we're working in real coordination with the architect, tribes, and the general contractor, so that we can do this in a very streamlined way. So the archaeologists who would be monitoring, or the paleontologists, excuse me, that would be monitoring, would have the qualifications to make assessments as to whether something is a cultural resource under CEQA or historical resource under CEQA, and then be able to work with staff to define the things that need to happen next. But usually, if something is even pulled from a construction site, typically it's kept in the offices of the archaeologist or the paleontologist, and these are agreements that are made between the monitors and the tribes prior to anything being found. And it's very important to pin this down, like, is something going to be cleaned or is not cleaned, or things like this. And then, so there's things you put in place before, and then there's things that are being put in place once things are found. Should something be reburied, and where would that site be on a project site, and things like that that you can't define ahead of time. But however, to have such a prescriptive process like this would take quite a lot of time, and it would be very impractical. So that's why it was struck.
Okay. So am I safe then in assuming that NAGPRA would cover the need for this? And that's, I know, really speaking towards human remains more than anything. But
Yeah, and on human remains, really, there is really no need to recite any sort of state or federal law, that is already in place in our local ordinance. It's something that, that a developer has to abide by. So if human remains are found, we usually do restate it when we are working, in entitlements, and we often will have as conditions of approval, something like that. But and sometimes that can appear on project plans. So on the construction set of plans, it's at the site. However, even if it appears nowhere, even if that language appears nowhere, they are still obligated to comply with federal and state law. And so yes, but that is law that we don't define. And yes, when human remains are discovered, there is a process defined under those laws. Yes, so those would be followed in that way.
So I think the reason that it caught my eye was because one of the most substantial projects that we did look at was the incidental discovery of indigenous footings when there was repaving in the city parking lot. And so just to make sure that we are covered, because I think one of the great unique features of San Gabriel is we do have a terrifically rich indigenous past, and a lot was paved over before particular attention was given to how you protect those artifacts. And I would hate for our ordinance to choose silence when we know that there's the potential that maybe more than some of our neighboring cities, we have that to contend with.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. Yes, no, I totally agree. And as I said, this process does take place. It just takes place in a truncated schedule, and it's led by the project archaeologist, who is qualified under the Secretary of the Interior standards. So, and so really, when you're thinking about this and a project comes before you, and there's concern, there may be a high sensitivity for Native American subsurface artifacts, or anything like that, or just archaeological subsurface material. That is the time to consider requiring monitoring during ground disturbing activities, and always that monitoring should be done in conjunction with tribes if there is a tribal. If there's concern that tribes have expressed, under the processes that they would consult with the city on, and make sure that those conditions of approval or mitigation measures, if there are mitigation, ensures that whoever is in charge of that monitoring operation, that they are qualified under the Secretary of the Interior standards.
Okay, thank you. Well, those were my questions. Do we have any public comment on this item?
No public comment at this time, Madam Chair.
All right, Then it is 7:50, and I will close public comment on this item. Are there any other comments from the commission?
Yeah, I had, I forgot one area. I don't, on, basically it would be page 1, 2, 3 of the non-struck through, under definitions, archaeological resource. About halfway down the paragraph where it says weapons, there's 2 commas there. I don't know. That was it. And then I did have one more question that I forgot to ask the first time around. Under 153610 and designation procedures, under F, at the city council determination, there's a section in there that I didn't quite understand, that if the city council has not taken action on the application within 180 days of the commission's recommendation, then the application shall be deemed denied. And I guess my question is what would trigger the 180 days to make that lapse? Is that something, is that a mechanism the city council could use, or like if they, I guess some clarification on that statement.
Typically, if it's associated with a permit streamlining requirement, it would be from the date that a submittal and application was determined to be complete and the applicant had provided all the required items to the city to review. And so long as there isn't any other missing materials for the commission or the council to consider, then there has to be progress in getting to a determination. So that's where that comes in.
Okay, so maybe I read it. If the city council has not taken action on the application within 180 days, so is that basically if the city council doesn't review it within that 180 days, that application is denied?
That if a determination is not made, then it's considered denied. So it's either a formal determination of approval or a formal determination of denial. And so if it gets to a point where a consensus or a determination cannot be reached, then it's an automatic denial as opposed to an automatic approval.
Okay, gotcha. I see. I understand. Okay, thank you.
Anything further? So that brings us to the sort of 2 questions that were posed in terms of terminology around planning district and the conservation overlay zone, and then also the incentive of review. So my colleagues like to discuss, do you have any direction that we can offer in terms of terminology around the planning district, which we've been hearing from ARG in their presentations, or the conservation overlay zone as it stands in the ordinance? I think the preservationist in me feels very comfortable with conservation overlay zone because it gives me a very clear picture, but I also understand the intent is to be able to communicate to the community, and anytime I've said conservation overlay zone, then I basically am trying to describe what that means, which I think planning district maybe captures better for the non-preservationist at heart. So we would like to make a recommendation that we align with what we've been hearing from ARG. Right now it stands as conservation overlay zone, and so the recommendation might be to staff that we adopt planning district in lieu of conservation overlay zone.
I guess I'm not 100% clear on what those mean. You know, and to make that call, I'm still a little, even though the explanation I kind of get it, but the difference between the conservation overlay zone and the planning district is still a little fuzzy to me.
No, go ahead. Please.
Okay, I'm so sorry, and sorry to confuse you. It is a confusing question, really. I was just kind of quickly rereading conservation overlay zone, and to be honest, I think if we, I think it's just a matter of what term you're most comfortable with. I think Chair Lubicic makes a good point that it's not exactly a user-friendly term, you know, for the community. But when I read the definition, I do believe that it could literally be just renamed planning zone, and the definition seems to stand for me. So I'm reading it through. It actually is exactly what I described. It's just the term, really. So I think it's just a matter of is the preference of the commission that it remains this term or becomes planning district. The definition remains the same. It's just, and I'm sorry if I confuse the situation, because usually we're using conservation overlay zone in a totally different way in different cities to really apply a layer of design standards, design guidelines, and development standards, and identify an area that is actually a designated historic district. That's why it's called that.
Because I think of some of the areas that were not identified as part of the inventory, but that have very unique features and characteristics, and the people who live there enjoy living there because of that. And so that might be an example of an area that we could have as a planning. Well, we have the formally identified planning districts in the inventory that were done, but.
Yes, you're right. With the consulting team identifying 2 planning districts, it doesn't necessarily mean there are not more that the city might identify, the commission might identify as other areas that should be more considered in local planning. And you certainly can do that. And one second. Yes, and actually I've had conversations with Sam staff about this, and because I do think it's a conversation worth having. These are areas that sort of have the potential to go one way or the other, you know? They don't have enough integrity to be eligible for designation as they sit right now. And we certainly can't determine something eligible based on a future event. You know, they might be restored to the extent, their integrity might be restored to the extent that they are eligible. If they are not eligible now, then they simply are not. However, we can influence the direction that these areas move in the design review process. You know, we can encourage development or sensitivity in modifications in such a way that supports a return of character and a return of integrity, so that maybe one day they may move into the category of being eligible. Or we may not. We may see, okay, this area is defined this way, and maybe this is an area where we allow, you know, there's more greater opportunity for development, or you know, something like that. Depends on the planning district we're talking about. But at any rate, I think this is where the opportunity lies for the commission to influence the future of these areas.
So based on that, a question that I have for staff is, would the term planning district be so nondescript as to be confused with other districting or processes that exist in the broader ordinance?
From a implementation standpoint, the other zones within the city are clearly defined in the other chapters of the zoning code. Planning district used specifically within the preservation ordinance would be applied specifically to preservation efforts. So it would not, because even from a planning use, a planning district doesn't really define too much, even in terms of development and zoning and use, yes.
Other questions or direction? Yeah.
I after hearing this, planning district sounds good to me, as far as that being a little bit more, or a little less esoteric, maybe, I guess, for that. So that would be my vote.
And I think what we can do to maybe help to clarify that is maybe include a cross-reference as it's used in the survey, in the historic resource survey, that it's defined. The planning district correlates with the survey.
Okay. So does that help in terms of direction?
Yes. So one thing that the commission may have seen is that the adjournment, and eventually we'll get there for the action, is to a special meeting next month. And so the additional direction would be whether we come back next month, first on the date that's identified as a special meeting, and then second, if the commission is also looking for further discussion with the comments provided this evening and incorporated in an update, or if the commission is at the point of potentially providing that recommendation to the Planning Commission.
Okay. So then the second topic to address was the incentive that you mentioned, and I'm sorry, I've lost the thread of what the direction you needed, just had the topic note, but with all of our other, looking at the ordinance. This was, I'm trying to remember which section you spoke to. It was to incentivize review.
Oh, that once the districts are defined, that that potentially on a policy level, that design standards and criteria be developed, and by doing so, this would allow projects to be reviewed under the commission instead of requiring Preservation Commission as well as Design Review Commission, just adding the additional review process.
I would think for applicants, that would be a very strong incentive in terms of their own timeline, process of review, the fact that the commission has specific roles attached, one of them being architect. I feel that we can get input on this commission, but I, again, would love to hear from my colleagues and their thoughts.
Yes, I think in that review process, I think that would be, I think it would be beneficial for us to be there. Is that the question, going through that? Yes, then yes, I'm a yes on that.
Commissioner Weeks or Commissioner Orena, do you?
No, and I agree. I just figured as long as it doesn't interrupt the time frame, right? Because I mean, you'd have to schedule an emergency meeting for all of this, and I know all of this is based on a specific timeline, right? So as long as that can be expedited in such a way where we could all meet and get all this done in the proper time frame.
I think that's a good point. Commissioner Weeks? Okay. So I'm comfortable with giving that incentive to the review as long as we maybe then are sure to make a change to at least quarterly so that there can be a bit more predictable meeting schedule and it gives some ability to not hold people up because our meetings are spaced out so much. All right. So with that, we'll take it as recommendations offered. And then as staff pointed out, our decision would be to reconvene in about a month's time with the idea that this would then move forward. Do you feel that a clean copy, that we would be able to address a clean copy to recommend onward in the approval to planning? I would love that. I'm sure you would as well. All right. So that brings us to item 5, staff items.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. The only item from staff this evening would be to remind all commissioners on all the commissions that the terms are up on May 30th of this year, and to make sure to file electronic applications. It's available on the website, and if access to that is required, please feel free to email city staff. And we'll be happy, also the city clerk's office, if you haven't already received that reminder. I think we've heard from other commissioners that sometimes the email goes to spam, so there's been a few cases where the city clerk's office reminder goes to spam. For the Preservation Commission, I believe it is the chair and the vice chair's terms that are up. And if there is any other spot that needs a new application, then staff will send that out. So please take a look at that. And again, the filing is electronic. And that's it.
Thank you. And then that brings us to commissioner comments, conference meeting reports. Each commissioner may address the commission on matters of general information and/or concern. This is also a time for commissioners to report on conferences and/or meetings they have attended. Commissioner DeVrent, anything to report?
Nothing to report at this time.
Okay, Commissioner Weeks? All right, Commissioner Urena?
I have nothing to report.
And as for me, I will give my, I think, standard reminder that the California Preservation Foundation always has really wonderful workshops. They have historic surveys, ordinances, 3 workshop series that they've been promoting, which can be very timely for understanding maybe how our ordinance fits alongside neighboring cities. And then the San Gabriel Historical Association has their speaker event this coming Monday. They always have a dinner and fundraiser that's attached to that. But the speaker that they've announced is the local historian for the San Gabriel Village. I've seen presentations in the past, and they're really wonderful. It's a very nice collection of photos and from longtime residents, people who have been in their family homes since they were constructed. So it's really a wonderful opportunity to learn more about the village. And so with that, we come to our adjournment, and I will go ahead and ask, do I need a motion? I forget. A motion to adjourn? No? Okay. To adjourn the Historic Preservation and Cultural Resource Commission to the special meeting of the Historic Preservation and Cultural Resource Commission on April 10th, 2024 at 6:30 p.m. at City Hall at 8:06 p.m.